Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drill Down. Donald Trump continues to march in Washington, D.C. with very little organized opposition. But there actually is some from an unlikely or surprising source. And they're, like Johnny Cash, dressed in black. We're going to dissect the opposition to Donald Trump and what the courts are doing with the co-host of this program, as always, Eric Eggers. Eric, how are you?
I'm excellent, Peter. We're glad to have you back. You know, we missed you last week, and clearly so did the audience. So,
well, thank you. I wanted to ask you, by the way, I've known you for a long time. You're, I think, a pretty fashionable guy. You don't wear a lot of black. Have you ever considered wearing black?
Well, some people like to say the quiet part out loud, and sometimes we just wear it.
Well, the most important opposition to Donald Trump right now is actually coming from people in black robes. It's the federal judiciary. And part of that is you have this massive leadership gap on the left. A recent poll done asked who should sort of lead the opposition to Donald Trump. 30%, nobody. And every other person named only got 10%. So really the political left is disorganized, and it's the courts now, the activist courts, that are stepping up and providing the resistance to what Trump is trying to accomplish in Washington.
Yeah, you have Chuck Schumer, who's facing potential, questions about his ability to be an effective leader. There's some quiet grassroots movement to get AOC to challenge him in the Senate, apparently, so much so that Bernie Sanders is leaving interviews when the question comes up.
Right.
And so to your point, there isn't a titular head of the left or their anti-Trump resistance. And so there isn't even an effective legislative strategy. I think that's one of the issues that Chuck Schumer is facing. But it is interesting that the one thing that seems to be happening is people, and by people I mean judges, have taken it upon themselves to stop all these executive orders from happening. And it underscores this really unique and weird feature of the legal system because they're able to kind of get away with it.
Right, exactly. We're going to unpack that today and explain how we got to the point where you have judge shopping, right? This is where if you want to challenge something that the federal government is doing, you try to find in the Trump administration, most liberal judge who's likely to oppose it, and you simply file in that district. That's actually a relatively new phenomenon. We're going to unpack that, and we're going to talk about this general problem with judicial review, right? We all recognize the Constitution wants to protect us from leaders who are overstepping their bounds. On the other hand, the system and this practice gets abused. And when it comes to Donald Trump, it seems to have been abused in a massive way. Just simply looking at the numbers, Harvard Law Review had a study that came out last year showed that under the George W. Bush administration, there were, I think, 5 cases where federal courts actually put a nationwide injunction in place to sort of resist what George W. Bush was doing. Barack Obama had 10. In Donald Trump's first term, just 4 years, there was something like close to 60 of them.
Yeah. No less than noted constitutional scholar, and I'm not being facetious about this. He actually is a constitutional scholar. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, was actually asked about this recently. Listen to what he had to say.
But something's happening right now, Trey, that I think we all have to acknowledge. You've got a lot of activist judges, probably more than ever. And we were looking at the statistics, and the White House has pointed this out. 62%, for example, of the federal injunctions that have been handed down in the last century were handed down against President Trump. And 92% of those were done by partisan Democrat-appointed judges. So something's amiss. I think we've got to address it, and I'm looking forward to working with our good friend, Chairman Jim Jordan in the House Judiciary Committee to sort through this and find out what the remedies are to figure out how we can bring correction here, because I think it's important for our system of justice.
Mike Johnson, they called Corey ten Boom the miracle worker. They may write a sequel. You may author it. You have done something really, really hard with an historically small margin. Mike Johnson from the great state of Louisiana, Speaker of the House, thank you for joining us on a Sunday night.
Yeah. Now, he's not the only one, by the way. Some people could say, well, this is just conservatives griping because the judiciary is putting Trump in check. You actually have a quote from Elena Kagan, right? I mean, she is appointed by a Democrat, by Barack Obama. She's clearly left of center, right? She has an interesting take on this issue of judicial shopping. So she's also recognized this is a problem.
And we'll play the Elena Kagan clip in just a second. But to put it into context, you heard Mike Johnson cite the stat that of these federal injunctions, which is to say one federal federal judge says, listen, there's been this executive order, there's something that we don't like, we're decreeing an injunction that will then appeal to the entire country. 62% of them have occurred during the Trump administration. 59 of them happened during his first term. Before that, no president since Ronald Reagan had more than 12. And so so this is a very new phenomenon. And when you combine that with a congressional law in 1988 that eliminated the requirement that if you're filing a claim in a court that you have to establish some sort of a connection to that area, then what that's led to is this practice called judge shopping or forum shopping, where the people decide, hey, we're going to have a better success rate with this judge in this place, so we're going to go here and file this because we think, not based on the merits of what we have to say, but because of the political leanings of this judge. That's the trend, and that is what Alegan Kagan was addressing when she said this.
But some district courts have very quickly issued nationwide injunctions to stop a policy in its tracks, that something that the president and or Congress has determined to be the national policy, and one district court stops it. And then you combine that with the ability of people to forum shop, to go to a particular district court where they think that will be the result. And you look at something like that and you think, well, that can't be right, that one district court, whether it's in the Trump years, people used to go to the Northern District of California, and in the Biden years, they go to Texas.
Now, let's talk about the current case that is getting so much of the headlines, and that involves this federal judge, right, in Washington, D.C., who has stepped in to block the administration using the Aliens Act to deal with Trenda Aragua, which is the Venezuelan criminal gang. This is a criminal gang that makes other criminal gangs look like wimps, really. I mean, the cases and the instances of brutality are shocking, even by criminal gang violence levels. They are organized. There's a lot of evidence that they are connected to Maduro, who's the leader of Venezuela, and they have been involved in all sorts of criminal activity. What did the federal judge do, and what rationale is he trying to use to prevent Trump from using this law?
Yeah, I'm absolutely going to address that. But before that, if you're a member of the lesser criminal gangs that Peter Schweizer just insulted, it's Peter.Schweizer at G. Like, I respect all criminal gangs out there. I don't even see color.
Here's what I like, is you're thinking like the Bloods and the Crips are going to sit down and send me an email about this.
Well, you're the one that talked to me about our podcast demos. I think the Bloods and the Crips are going to wake up, they're going to do their Saratoga water routine, and then they're going to listen to this podcast and write you an angrily worded, I think, email. Yeah, that's what I envision. So, so it's really fascinating, this Trenda Aragua thing, because this judge, who now is facing calls from the right to be impeached, he basically said that the Trump administration acted quite hastily when they efforted to deport these people, and the Trump administration has had to concede that they don't necessarily have evidence that every one of these people have a criminal record, and so it becomes this. And the judge is like, look, I'm not saying to let them go, but you don't just get to deport them right away because you've said they're a member of this gang. They should have some aspect of relief. They should at least be able to appeal the fact that you've designated them to be a part of a gang. But it's interesting because these guys were literally mid-flight when this judge said, no, I'm trying to put a halt to this. And the Trump administration says, well, it was a written order. It was a verbal order, not a written order, so it doesn't apply as much. And so they just kept the plane going. And by the way, this has prompted an increased and a heightened level of interest by the part of the media. Well, wait, now where are these people going? Because some of them have gone to El Salvador, and now some of them have gone to, I believe, Colombia. And Venezuela recently said. And what's funny is, like, the media now really, really cares about where these Venezuelan gang members are going. They sure didn't care when they had taken over apartment complexes in Colorado. We didn't really, no, that's not a real thing.
Yeah, it was just a couple of cars. Remember, there was a question, they asked J.D. Vance, and he said, it's just a couple of apartment buildings.
So like, when they were, like, living free and terrorizing active American citizens, don't care. When they've been incarcerated, now it's like, where are they? When are they going to land? Like, that. I mean, that's how messed up this is. But absolutely. So the judge, in a 37-page opinion, he rejected the administration's request to lift this restraining order. Now, he says he's imposed no restrictions on the government's ability to apprehend them, but it's literally just about the deportation. And so that's what they're kind of arguing about. But, like, this is one of the many injunctions that we're sort of highlighting as part of this larger trend.
Right. And here's the part of his rationale I don't understand, right? all these individuals that are being deported, they're not U.S. citizens. They don't have permanent resident status. They're in the country illegally. And part of the reason that they send them to this maximum security prison in El Salvador is that their own country, Venezuela, up until just a couple of days ago, wouldn't take them. Right? They wouldn't take them. So, to me, the notion that if you were in the country illegally, and the vast majority of these, I believe, have been arrested, right? There was a couple of cases the New York Post highlighted.
Yeah.
You had a guy that
these are bad dudes.
Yeah, these are bad dudes. The notion that we're supposed to apply the civil liberties and rights that apply to ordinary citizens when you're in the country illegally and you are engaged in what pretty much clears to be criminal activity, I say just kick him out of the country.
Yeah.
And I don't understand how you can argue that the act that they're applying, which allows you, if you are facing a foreign threat and danger, which I believe that this gang is, it's clearly linked to Maduro, who does not like us, who's anti-United States, why we simply can't do this. And I think this is part of the frustration that people get from the overreach.
Well, so on day one, the Trump administration declared Trenda Aragua as a terrorist organization, which then they would say empowered them to be able to do lots of different things, including this.
Right.
I think some people would raise, just from a due process standpoint,
Yeah.
and I don't, you don't want to be the dude, like, while these gang members are raping and killing people, like, oh, well, let's talk about due process.
Right.
Did you file the paperwork? But it is like, because when it's a Venezuelan gang that's causing a lot of criminal activity, nobody has a problem. But what if it's a concerned Christian Tea Party parent who goes to a school board meeting, and then you have a different administration's FBI saying, well, maybe these guys are terrorist organizations? And so it does raise questions of how much do you have to do to prove they're part of this gang,
right,
so that they're then eligible for treatment like a terrorist and ultimately deportation? I think it's a valid legal question.
Yeah, and this is the point Rand Paul makes, right? This is the point Rand Paul has been concerned about this, and I do agree. You don't want to just let the government to do this, but in my mind, there's a clear difference between parents in, say, Richmond, Virginia, right? That was the case where the Catholic
Which
schools...
side of Richmond? Are we talking about Richmond University or VCU? Because those are different.
But I'm saying, if you are parents, if you are American citizens, in my mind, you have different rights than somebody who has illegally come into the country, who's involved in criminal gang activity or has all the indications that they are. I'm not saying that you allow for, torture or brutality, but the notion that this person is now entitled to a hearing, there needs to be a judicial review, that we're supposed to pay for housing this person in some kind of a facility, that we as the taxpayer should pay for their lawyer to the review, to me is just completely nonsensical. So I appreciate and understand we need to make sure that the same government that's doing this on our behalf can't be turned against us, applying the same principles. But to me, it's a totally different thing.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I do think the fact that this one injunction out of the many that are now being, kind of foisted upon the second Trump administration when they faced 59 on the first type speaks to, like, something's going to happen. Yeah. And that the left is going to claim, well, this is what we meant when democracy is on the ballot. But just consider these stats, because, there's a reason why, and we were talking about this before, and I was like, well, are the judges really going after Donald Trump, or is it just that the Trump administration is doing so many executive orders, they're just doing so many things that this is the only way you can kind of fight back? But it does appear to be a very effective way to fight back. And I think, well, which one's really the threat to democracy? The president, who's been democratically elected, deciding that they want to do these things, or these judges who then get to, in effect, make policy or stop policy from being enacted because of just the numbers. So listen to this. So the Supreme Court, on average, I didn't realize this, they see less than 100 cases annually. Okay, so the Supreme Court, top of the judiciary branch of the government. There's 13 U.S. appeals court that handle over 50,000 cases a year. And there's 600 federal trial judges divided over 90 districts. And so you have these cases that come to these federal judges, and then if a judge decides, hey, I'm going to issue this injunction, the amount of time, this is what the Elena Kagan quote was talking about, that it would take for it to become one of the 100 Supreme Court cases is lengthy. And so the judge at the federal level's decision, in effect, becomes the law until it can potentially be appealed at the District Court of Appeals, or if it's seen by the Supreme Court. And that's kind of where this case with the Venezuelan gangs are now, the Trump administration originally asked this judge to reverse himself. He declined, and then they're waiting to see if it will be taken up on appeal. And in the meantime, he's like, well, I've stopped this deportation.
Yeah, no, you're right. And that's the thing. You kind of flood the zone, right? If they can handle 100 cases a year and you file different injunctions in different locations, and to the point of democracy being on trial, think about this. When Donald Trump ran, whether you liked him or not, whether you voted for him or not, he was crystal clear what he was going to do. He's not ambiguous. He's not going back on promises. He wasn't deceptive. He was crystal clear on what he was going to do. That, to me, seems to be the Democratic option, as opposed to a federal judge who has been on the bench for, at least a dozen years or around a dozen years, deciding sort of unilaterally. He has the authority to block this and to prevent it from being carried forward. Again, to me, in a case that does not even involve the civil liberties of Americans, it involves the civil liberties of people that are operating. The other thing to be said, by the way, is this wasn't just a Trump executive order. Yes, the designation as a terrorist organization was, and he certainly is in the confines of doing so, but what Trump is saying is, I'm taking this law, this Aliens Act that has been used before, and I'm applying it in this particular case. It's been abused in the past when it came to U.S. citizens, but in this particular case, I think its use is completely legitimate.
Well, so there's this case, and then there's other instances where district court judges have temporarily blocked these efforts to do other things, including ban transgender people from serving in the military. There's been executive orders that would seek to end birthright citizenship, which we've spoken about before. And then there's also the mass firing of these federal probationary workers. So these are all things the Trump administration says, hey, we're going to do this, but then other opponents of those strategies find a judge, and the judge shopping statistics are really interesting. We'll talk about that quickly. But the point is, people now know who to go to get the thing that you want to. You heard Elena Kagan say that during the Trump years, you go to the Northern California districts or to Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
When Biden was president, everybody goes to dang Texas because there's one judge in Texas, in Amarillo, Texas, in fact, that they say is like your go-to guy. And so it is, it's meant to be, the government should work together. You got the legislative branch, you got the judicial branch, and you got the executive branch. I don't think it's supposed to work like this.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And look, on the issue of like birthright citizenship you were talking about, I have strong views on that. I don't think that they are interpreting the 14th Amendment accurately when they say anybody that sneaks across the border, their child has citizenship. But I can see the need there for judicial review, because that is a constitutional question, right? It's in the Constitution. There's ambiguity. And you have a president who's issued an executive order. There's been no congressional action. Yeah, that makes sense to me. You have judicial review. But in a lot of other cases, this to me is an extension of lawfare, right? This is kind of what they did to Trump when they tried to put him in jail, when they tried to
remember that?
It seems like ages ago, doesn't it, by the way? And it really springs out of lawfare, which developed 25 years ago. A lot of people don't realize lawfare started when the global war on terrorism was winding up. And lawyers said, hey, we can use the law in a way to harass terrorist organizations. We can use the law to seize their assets, to stop their bank accounts. And the problem is the global war on terrorism ended, and a lot of the people in the Obama national security section of DOJ decided, you know what, we're going to take this and we're going to apply it to our domestic opponents, Donald Trump being the main one. So it's clearly part of this concerted strategy to undermine the integrity of our system.
So it's interesting you talk about the language that we use for terrorists, and we've talked about those are just bad dudes. That's actually precisely the language that one of the judges in a case with Donald Trump actually used about Donald Trump. Judge Arthur Engoron actually told Donald Trump's attorney that the president was, quote, just a bad guy who Letitia James should go after. And so, he's one example of a few that gets held up as judges who have, they're considered activist judges. They're certainly not balanced and neutral arbiters of the law. And so when you combine the fact that the judges are becoming more activist with the fact that you've got like them engaging more from a judicial shopping standpoint, it's a problem.
So here's the question, Eric, looking forward. This 1988 law, I'm fascinated about it. I don't think we've had time to delve more deeply into it, but you wonder, how did a law like that get passed? Why did they pass a law? Because it used to be, this is why it was so rare, it used to be if you filed, for example, in Amarillo, Texas or in San Francisco, you had to show and demonstrate that it was specific to the case and that you were not judge shopping. They ended that in 1988, making it a lot easier. You kind of wonder who lobbied for that and who wanted it. I imagine trial lawyers would probably be some of the constituents, but maybe we need to go back to the previous way of doing it.
Well, and it's led to things like, so yeah, in 1988, the Congress lifted the requirement that you had to have some connection to the division that you're filing the case in. That no longer exists. And so what it's led to is, but it's actually led to like important law. So the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, the national anti-abortion organization that was based in Tennessee, they incorporated an office in Amarillo and then sued there just after the Supreme Court reversed Roe versus Wade. And then Donald Trump, who we know he has lived in New York and we know he lives in Florida, he sued CBS in Amarillo on the ground. This is like one of those filings that some residents of the town of Amarillo watched the interview he did with 60 Minutes and watched the interview that Kamala Harris did with 60 Minutes and may have had some issues with it. So there's some contortion from an intellectual and logical standpoint that people do. But the point is they go where they think it's going to be successful, and it has been successful, and that's why the process goes this way.
Yeah, well, look, I know both sides have done this. I think the left has done it more extensively, clearly. If you look at the cases, the data bears that out. But it'd be great to go, I think, back to the old system, because you want the judicial system to be there to keep in check the executive and the legislative, right? They're equal branches of government. None is supposed to be supreme. But with this kind of arrangement where you can sort of look at the field and decide who's going to be the one you're going to go to, it makes the judicial system supreme, because now you just need one guy or one lady somewhere with a robe on, and they can stop it across the entire country. And it seems to me, whether the left or right is doing that, it's a terrible way to do it.
So do you feel like it's more of a forum or judge shopping issue, or it's more of the volume has increased so much, so it's almost like the federal judiciary needs to be more selective, or we need to be more selective in terms of limiting the power to decree a national injunction? It's like, so we're going to flag this, and that's something that you heard Mike Johnson say, we're going to look at this. And so I think that is the thing to be aware of. They will do something to try to limit the power of these federal judges to, in effect, craft policy or stop policy from being crafted until the Supreme Court can look at it. Maybe forum shopping is one aspect of it, but they're going to do something else, and then people are going to lose their minds, because now you're going to have members of Congress telling judges or limiting what the judges can do in terms of what their rulings.
Yeah, well, the Constitution is always about certain principles, and one of those principles is you want divided power, so we want to have judicial review. On the other hand, the Constitution also recognizes that those principles are eternal, but you have to also account for the current circumstance on making sure that those principles aren't being abused. And I think the sheer volume of cases is a huge problem. I'm not an attorney. I don't know how to fix that. But I think they need to deal with the forum shopping. They need to deal with judges that are, consistently being overruled. I mean, the purpose of a judge is not simply to say, here is my opinion. They are supposed to reflect what the Constitution or what the law says. And part of that is what the Supreme Court has, said in the past. My point being, if you are, let's say, a very liberal judge in San Francisco, and you're ruling on a case, and you know that you are going to be overruled, you're supposed to take that into account. You're not supposed to just say, well, I'm going to reject this. I'm going to put a hold on it, and that's going to buy my side a couple of years or maybe for good, because the Supreme Court can't review it. That is just an abuse of judicial authority.
Well, think about it. It also changes fundamentally the math of the law.
Yeah.
Right. Because to your point, that's what the incentive should have been. The incentive should be, I'm trying to be consistent with the law, and it's a bad look for me to be overturned.
Right.
But if what you do, even if it gets overturned in a couple of years, but you've in effect delivered a policy win to a side with whom you're ideologically aligned, like now you're not so much worried about what your reputation as a judge is. Like there's a new constituency, for better of a term, for better.
They get cheered on by their side.
And, when you leave the judgeship, now you can be a partner at a different law firm. I mean, it seems like it creates a perverse incentive structure. That's among the things I feel like they should take a look at.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Well, we appreciate you as always listening to this podcast. We know that your time is important. We hope we've shed some light for you on what is going on and maybe some of the changes that need to be taking place. Eric Eggers, the co-host of this program, has agreed in light of this discussion that next week he is going to dress in all black. Are you going to
You're completely misunderstanding these trends here. Not only did you not know about the Saratoga water, you don't know that the trend is actually away from going anything other than like Gavin Newsom's podcast guest, which is all white guys. So it's that way.
I guess Go Woke, Go Broke has now infected Gavin Newsom.
We'll be joining Gavin shortly.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to listen to us. You can find out more at thedrilldown.com. And, of course, you can subscribe to this podcast wherever fine podcasts are located. Until next time, thank you very much.